Their troops are going to their deaths on golf carts. So there are lots of reasons why, economically and militarily, Putin may well want a breather.
The Sunday Times' Mark Urban is here, as he is every Monday, to talk us through the big foreign policy, diplomatic and defence stories. Hello, Mark. Welcome back.
It's an unbridled pleasure to be back.
And for me, I mean, bridled pleasures are not something for the radio,
No,
I think.
just
So
for
it's good to have you here. Let's start with Saudi Arabia. Riyadh, the negotiations going on there. There are countless questions about whether a peace deal between Russia and Ukraine can be negotiated. You wrote in the Sunday Times that the answers are going to start to become clearer today with those talks.
And actually, even yesterday, I think these are what they call proximity talks. So the Russians and the Ukrainians are not in the same room. They are shuttling back and forth to the Americans, who are doing the kind of proxy negotiating with the two sides. And I think this is a very interesting moment because for reasons I think we probably both understand, our kind of public narrative about this is very dominated by Ukrainian perspectives. Mm-hmm. And for many, many months, a lot of Ukrainians were saying, Putin is not interested in peace, full stop. Now, of course, they may well still be right in the broader sense, but I think what we now know is that he is interested in a ceasefire. Now, I think the people who say, oh, well, he just wants to avoid a blame game with Trump, I don't think so. I think we know that Russia is hurting in many ways. I mean, last week, the defense intelligence people came up with an assessment, 250,000 killed in the Russian military since they started this full-scale invasion in 2022. We know that the Russian economy is in a dire state. We know that although parts of Russian military industry have really stepped up production, there are other things like APCs, armoured personnel carriers, which they just cannot make. And consequently, their troops are going to their deaths on golf carts. So there are lots of reasons why, economically and militarily, Putin may well want a breather. The problem is he's been so open in his sort of contempt for Ukrainian nationhood and allowing any genuine independence to Ukrainians that people doubt that he's interested in anything more than that breather. So the question, look, let's get to a ceasefire first. That's what they're talking about. They were talking about yesterday, today in Riyadh. That's about saying, OK, step by step, we start by de-targeting one another's power stations, oil installations, that kind of stuff. Second step, we de-target shipping in the Black Sea that belongs to one side or the other. Those, we know, are the first elements of this negotiation. But the intention on the American side, and they've made some very upbeat statements about this, the State Department saying we're a breath away from a full ceasefire. Well, let's see. But I think if we get to the full ceasefire, then the really fundamental questions start about, is Russia prepared to see a strong Ukraine, in this world going forward? I
mean, there seems to be a pattern that as soon as something is floated, like infrastructure is not going to be attacked, immediately the Russians hit infrastructure. Presumably now they're floating a maritime ceasefire. What's going to happen in the run-up to that is the Ukraine going to try and hit the boats. So there does seem to be a big sort of rhetoric reality gap. Do we know?
People always go, but I'm afraid, the military will be the military. We've seen this in many other parts of the world, that once a serious peace negotiation starts, they think, oh, we've only got a limited amount of time now to hit those targets. So I don't think we can read too much into the fact. What we need some clarity about is, when is this actually supposed to start? Because it was claimed initially by the Russians it would start when, once Putin got off the phone with Trump a few days ago, and obviously it didn't. So I think, that's another thing we need clarity on.
Well, linked to this, obviously, let's talk about Steve Witkoff, because he's Trump's special envoy to the Middle East, but he met Putin 10 days ago as well, and he's been speaking to the podcaster Tucker Carlson.
What the hell is going on with European League? Keir Starmer saying we're going to send British troops. Their entire military is smaller than the U.S. Marine Corps. The country is dying economically. All those countries are dying economically. Like, what are they thinking? What is that? Is that a posture? Is it a pose?
Well, I think it's a combination of a posture and a pose, and a combination of also being simplistic. I think there's this, this sort of notion of we've all got to be like Winston Churchill. The Russians are going to march across Europe. I think that's preposterous, by the way. We have something called NATO that we did not have in World War II.
Do you think the Russians want to march across Europe?
100% not.
So that's Trump's special envoy, Steve Witkoff there. Look, from a European perspective, he's extraordinarily off message. And just the whole sort of concept that the Americans seem to be bringing to the table seems to be we don't need security guarantees. If we get the business aspect of this, the America has the right business interests in Ukraine, that's enough to keep the peace. Are these people living in the real world, or are we not living in the real world?
Well, and I mean, that was a pretty extraordinary interview in many, many different ways. I mean, Witkoff was also talking in sort of visionary terms about all the wonderful things that would be possible with Russia, if they could sort of settle their differences and cooperate productively, including even talking about AI. The idea of sharing AI secrets with Russia is pretty astounding, really. Yeah, I mean, it was a proper cold shower, wasn't it? The Carlson podcast with Witkoff, because it just underlined how great these gaps are. I mean, as always, I'll have my little caveats. I mean, Trump, in this respect, we've seen it with quite a few previous American presidents, this idea of a reset, or, surely we can get off to a different kind of relationship with Russia. And, of course, each time, if it's Putin who's been in office, those hopes have been dashed. The other thing, the rude remarks about Starmer, which clearly diplomatically are pretty disastrous, really, when Keir Starmer and Emmanuel Macron are trying so hard to put a force together. I think there is some point there. I mean, when we were talking just now about how do you turn a ceasefire into something more substantial, the step after bringing about the ceasefire is confidence-building measures, monitoring, all that stuff. And an international force would be an extremely helpful thing. And, of course, Keir Starmer is trying to fill that gap. But I think where Witkoff had a tiny point was, I think Starmer knows this only too well, a lot of European allies have sort of looked at their boots when asked, what would you send to solidify peace in Ukraine? And it's a real problem at the moment. So much so that, this idea of a UN force, could India and China be going in? All that sort of stuff is now rising up the agenda again, because Europe does not seem able to put together a sort of proper-sized force that would go in there, even to do the most sort of basic job. They're not supposed to be peacekeeping or holding the front line. They'd be far from the front line. And even that is too much for most European governments.
Well, until about, 5 days ago, Witkoff's great triumph was peace in the Middle East, and that's obviously not that peaceful right now. But Mike Waltz was also talking about Iran over the weekend. He said the US is seeking full disarmament of Iran's nuclear program. What can we understand about the White House's strategy when it comes to Iran, and how does that link with everything else in the Middle East right now?
Well, I think that this is something we've talked about before, and I think it's pretty clear now that Trump has, some people have talked about 2 months for Iran to sort of start negotiating seriously about coming back into compliance in terms of limiting its nuclear activities and, renouncing any nuclear weapons program. Conversely, you see a lot of people on the radical side of politics in Iran saying, no, the lesson of what's happened in recent months with the Israeli attacks in response to Iran's missile attacks on Israel and the exposure of how vulnerable they are to air attack is that they should go hell for leather for the bomb. So I think things are coming to some sort of crisis point with this. Now, does this start sooner or later? At the end of this week, you've got Jerusalem Day for Quds Day for the Iranian leadership. It's always a big calendar event. We're expected to hear from the supreme leader. And against the backdrop of that, American increased attacks on the Houthis, supported by Iran in Yemen, with America also saying, look, if the Houthis don't stop attacking international shipping and sending missiles towards Israel, that the US may well hold Iran responsible. So you've got the possibility of a short-term engagement directly with Iran because of what's happening with the Houthis. And then in the slightly longer term, 2-3 months out, there does seem to be a definite intent on the part of the Trump administration to try and coerce Iran back into nuclear compliance. So that is definitely one to watch.
Finally, Mark, can we see any overarching sort of philosophy here? Because when you look at what's happening in Europe with Russia and Ukraine, the White House philosophy seems to be demilitarize the conflict. You look at what's happening in the Middle East, it's sort of bombs and guns. And so, I mean, can we see any sort of thread that connects these two approaches, or are they just the opposite?
Well, when in the first week or two, or just leading up to Trump's inauguration, there was a lot of comment that Witkoff actually was going to strong-arm Netanyahu. And then when the ceasefire did come in January, there was this suggestion that Trump had strong-armed Netanyahu. Now, I think I was always of the view that was convenient for Netanyahu to brief out to his far-right coalition partners. I'm being forced to do it, sort of thing. But now we've seen a quite different approach with regard to Gaza, with this extraordinary Trump idea of forcing people out of there. So, no, it's not coherent, but I wouldn't be surprised if Trump had given the Israelis certain time limits, right, just as he has with Iran, and said, look, do what you want, sort the hostage situation out. And if that doesn't work in a month or two, he may show a very different face to Netanyahu. He also, had one of his envoys negotiating for hostages, which really annoyed Netanyahu. So... Yeah. Well, look, I'm sure we'll be talking about all of that in the weeks to come. Thank you very much indeed, Mark Urban. You can, of course, hear Mark this time every Monday. You can read him in the Sunday Times as well.